The dust clung to Dahlia Vance's worn boots as she trudged along the cracked earth of southern Arizona territory. Two wooden buckets hanging from the yoke across her shoulders, their weight making her back scream with each step she took in the relentless August sun of 1882. She had been making this journey for 3 years now, ever since her father died and left her and her younger brother Samuel alone on their small homestead, 5 miles outside Columbia. The nearest water source was the creek that ran through the valley, a full 3 miles from their modest cabin, and every single day she made the trip twice, sometimes 3 times when the heat was particularly brutal and the vegetables in their garden were wilting despite her best efforts. Her mother had died giving birth to Samuel 14 years ago, and her father had succumbed to pneumonia during a harsh winter. At 22 years old, Dahlia had become both mother and father to her brother, determined to keep their small piece of land and make something of the life their parents had tried to build. The buckets sloshed as she walked, precious water threatening to spill with each uneven step. She had learned to walk with a peculiar gait, smooth and measured, to minimize the loss. Her shoulders bore permanent indentations from the yoke, and her hands were calloused from years of hard work. She wore her dark hair in a practical braid that hung down her back, and her simple cotton dress, faded from sun and washing, was patched in several places. She was not a woman who had time for vanity or dreams beyond survival. As she crested the hill that overlooked the valley, she paused to catch her breath, setting the buckets down carefully. From here she could see the neighboring property, the Thornton Ranch, which sprawled across hundreds of acres of grazing land. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones scattered across tan canvas, and she could make out the main house in the distance, a substantial structure that spoke of prosperity and security, two things that felt like distant myths to her. She had seen the rancher from afar on occasion, a tall man who sat his horse with easy confidence, but their paths had never crossed in any meaningful way. The wealthy ranchers and the struggling homesteaders existed in different worlds, even when those worlds were separated by only a few miles. She picked up her buckets again, ignoring the protest of her shoulders, and continued her journey home. Samuel would be waiting, probably hungry, definitely restless. At 14, he was at that difficult age where he resented being left behind, but was not quite old enough to take on the truly heavy work. She had him tend to their small vegetable garden and their 3 chickens, but the water carrying was her burden alone. The buckets were too heavy for him, and she would not risk him injuring himself. He was all she had left in this world. By the time she reached their cabin, the sun had climbed higher, and sweat ran down her back in rivulets. She poured the water carefully into their storage barrel, watching the level rise with satisfaction. One more trip today, and they would have enough for drinking, cooking, and watering the garden. Tomorrow she would start all over again. "Dahlia, there is a rider coming," Samuel called from the window, his voice cracking in that way it had been doing lately, hovering between boyhood and manhood. She walked to the door, shading her eyes against the glare. Sure enough, a lone horseman was approaching their property, sitting tall in the saddle. As he drew closer, she recognized him as Xavier Thornton himself, the rancher whose land bordered theirs. Her heart began to beat faster, not from attraction but from anxiety. When wealthy men came calling on struggling homesteaders, it rarely meant anything good. Perhaps he wanted to buy their land. Perhaps he had some complaint about their property. He reined in his horse, a beautiful chestnut mare that probably cost more than everything Dahlia owned combined, and removed his hat politely. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had thought, perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking light brown, almost amber in the bright sunlight, and his face was handsome in a weathered, masculine way. He wore good quality clothes, not fancy but well made, and there was an air of quiet competence about him. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "I am Xavier Thornton. I own the ranch to the east." "I know who you are, Mr. Thornton," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" He seemed slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. "I have noticed you making the journey to the creek. Every day, sometimes multiple times, carrying water." She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The idea that he had been watching her, that her struggles were visible to others, made her want to disappear into the earth. "We manage just fine," she said, lifting her chin defensively. "I did not mean to imply otherwise," he said quickly. "I only meant to say that I have been thinking about your situation. That is a long distance to carry water, especially in this heat." "We do what we must," she said. "Was there something specific you needed, Mr. Thornton?" "I have work to attend to." He replaced his hat, looking slightly taken aback by her brusque manner. "No, I suppose not. I just wanted to introduce myself properly. We are neighbors, after all." She watched him ride away, feeling a mixture of shame and irritation. She did not need his pity. She did not need anyone looking at her as some sort of object of charity or concern. She and Samuel were surviving, and that was enough. But that night, as she soaked her aching feet in a basin of precious water, she could not stop thinking about his amber eyes and the genuine concern she had heard in his voice. She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. Men like Xavier Thornton did not concern themselves with women like her beyond a passing moment of pity. She had learned long ago that survival meant keeping her head down and her expectations low. The next morning, she made her journey to the creek as always, the yoke settling into its familiar grooves on her shoulders. The summer heat was building already, even in the early morning hours, and she knew it would be a scorching day. As she knelt by the creek, filling her buckets with the clear, cold water, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart sank. She did not want another encounter with Xavier Thornton and his well-meaning concern, but when she looked up, it was him, dismounted this time, leading his horse to the water. He nodded politely but did not approach her directly, giving her space. She appreciated that, the fact that he was not trying to force conversation. She finished filling her buckets and fitted the yoke across her shoulders, grunting slightly with the effort of standing under the weight. "Miss Vance," he called out, just as she was about to leave. "Would you permit me to ask you a question?" She turned, trying not to show how much the weight of the water was already making her shoulders ache. "You can ask. I cannot promise I will answer." "Fair enough," he said, a slight smile touching his lips. "How long have you been making this journey?" "3 years," she said. "Since my father died." "And you make it how many times a day?" "Twice, usually. Sometimes 3 times in summer." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing calculations in his head. "That is 18 miles a day, carrying at least 30 pounds of water." "I am aware of the distance, Mr. Thornton. Have you ever considered digging a well on your property?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course I have considered it. Do you have any idea what it costs to dig a well? I can barely afford seed for the garden. A well is an impossible dream." "What if it was not impossible?" he asked quietly. She stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean? What if I had a well dug on your property? My treat, so to speak." The anger came swift and hot. "I do not accept charity, Mr. Thornton. We may be poor, but we have our pride." "It would not be charity," he said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "It would be a neighborly gesture. Besides, having another water source in the area benefits everyone. During droughts, we all help each other out. Consider it an investment in the community." "No," she said firmly. "Thank you for the offer, but no." She walked away before he could argue further, the water sloshing in her buckets with her agitated steps. The audacity of the man, thinking he could just solve her problems with his money, as if she were some sort of charity case. She fumed all the way home, her anger making her almost forget the weight on her shoulders. But over the following days, as she continued her endless journeys to the creek and back, she found herself thinking about his offer. A well would change everything. She could expand the garden, maybe even get a cow. Samuel could have baths more than once a week. She could wash their clothes properly instead of the minimal rinsing she did now to conserve water. They could actually thrive instead of merely surviving. Her pride warred with her practical nature, and practical nature was winning. She saw Xavier several more times at the creek over the next week. He was always polite, always respectful of her space, never pushing his offer. But she could feel his eyes on her as she struggled with the heavy buckets, and she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see a woman, or just a problem to be solved? Finally, on a particularly brutal day when the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees, and she had collapsed twice on the journey home, her pride crumbled. The next morning she waited at the creek, knowing he often watered his horse there in the early hours. He arrived as the sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink and gold. When he saw her standing there, empty buckets at her feet, something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, or satisfaction at having won. "Mr. Thornton," she said before she could lose her nerve. "About your offer." "The well." "Yes," he dismounted, giving her his full attention. "I will accept, but on one condition. This is a loan, not a gift. I will pay you back every cent, even if it takes me the rest of my life." He was quiet for a long moment, and she braced herself for argument. Instead, he said, "Agreed. We will draw up a proper contract. You can pay me back when you are able, no interest." She wanted to argue about the interest, because surely that was part of the charity she was trying to avoid, but she found she was too tired and too relieved to fight. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, rusty from disuse. "The crew will be out tomorrow to start surveying the best location," he said. "It should take about 2 weeks to dig and install everything properly." She nodded, suddenly feeling overwhelmed. 2 weeks and her life would change. 2 weeks and the burden she had carried for 3 years would be lifted. "Miss Vance," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up at him. "May I speak plainly? I suppose so. I did not make this offer out of pity. I made it because watching you carry that water every day, watching you work yourself to exhaustion, was becoming intolerable. You are one of the strongest people I have ever encountered, man or woman, but strength should not have to mean suffering." She did not know what to say to that. No one had spoken to her with such direct honesty in years. Most people in Colombia either ignored the struggling homesteaders or viewed them with a mixture of pity and contempt. But Xavier Thornton seemed to see her as a person, as someone worthy of respect. "I should get my water," she said finally, not knowing how else to respond. "Let me help you," he offered, reaching for one of her buckets. "I can manage," she said automatically. "I know you can," he said gently, "but you do not have to." And so, for the first time in 3 years, Dahlia Vance did not carry the water alone. Xavier filled one bucket while she filled the other, and then he insisted on carrying both back to her property, leading his horse with one hand. She walked beside him, feeling strange and off balance without the familiar weight on her shoulders. They did not talk much, but the silence was comfortable, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional bird call. Samuel was shocked to see the rancher helping his sister, and even more shocked when Xavier explained about the well. The boy's face lit up with an excitement Dahlia had not seen in years, and she felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was the right choice, pride be damned. True to his word, Xavier had a crew at her property the next morning, 3 experienced well diggers who treated her with professional courtesy and got to work immediately. They determined the best location was about 50 yards from the cabin, where the water table was closest to the surface. Dahlia watched them work, still half believing this was some sort of dream. Xavier came by every day to check on the progress, and Dahlia found herself looking forward to his visits. He would talk to the crew, then spend a few minutes with her, asking about her garden, about Samuel, about her plans once the well was complete. She learned that he had inherited his ranch from his father 2 years ago, that he had a younger sister married and living in Tucson, that he had always wanted to raise horses in addition to cattle, but had not yet had the time to pursue that dream. She found herself sharing things she had not spoken about in years. How her mother had loved to sing, how her father had dreamed of one day having a proper orchard, how she sometimes felt like she was failing them both by barely managing to keep the homestead afloat. Xavier listened with genuine interest, never offering platitudes or empty reassurances, just listening as if her words mattered. On the 8th day of digging, one of the crew members called out excitedly. They had hit water, and it was a good, strong source. They would spend the next several days installing the pump and ensuring everything was properly sealed and safe, but the hard part was done. Dahlia felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. Samuel whooped with joy and hugged her tight, and over his shoulder, she saw Xavier watching them with an expression of such warmth that it made her heart skip. That evening, after the crew had left for the day and Samuel had gone to check on the chickens, Xavier lingered. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air had finally cooled to something bearable. "I want to thank you properly," Dahlia said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Would you stay for supper?" It would not be anything fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it would be our way of showing gratitude. "I would be honored," Xavier said, and the genuine pleasure in his voice made her smile. She cooked while he sat at their small table, talking easily with Samuel about horses and cattle and the state of the territory. She listened to them as she worked, marveling at how easily Xavier connected with her brother, treating him like a young man rather than a child. Samuel was clearly smitten with hero worship, and she could not blame him. Xavier Thornton was exactly the kind of man she would want Samuel to become, strong but gentle, successful but humble, confident but kind. The meal was simple, but they ate like it was a feast. Xavier complimented her cooking with such sincerity that she blushed, unused to praise. They talked late into the evening, long after Samuel had been sent to bed, sitting on the porch and watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. "Can I ask you something personal?" Xavier said, breaking a comfortable silence. "You can ask," she said, echoing her words from their earlier conversation. "Why did you never remarry? After your father died, I mean. It would have made things easier having a husband to help with the work." She was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I suppose I never saw the point. Most men who would be interested in a poor homesteader's daughter would want the land more than me. And I was not willing to give up what my parents built just to have someone to share the burden. Better to carry it alone than to lose everything." "That is a lonely way to live," he observed. "Perhaps," she agreed, "but loneliness is better than losing yourself." He turned to look at her, his amber eyes serious in the starlight. "What if you could have both, partnership without loss?" Her heart began to beat faster. "I suppose that would depend on the partner." I suppose it would, he said softly. The well was completed 2 days later. Dahlia stood before the pump, Samuel beside her, and Xavier and his crew watching from a respectful distance. She placed her hand on the handle and pumped. For a moment, nothing happened, and then water gushed forth, clear and cold and endless. She laughed, a sound of pure joy, and Samuel immediately stuck his head under the flow, whooping as the water soaked his hair. The crew packed up their equipment, and Xavier paid them from his own pocket, waving away Dahlia's reminder about their loan agreement. "We will settle accounts later," he said. "For now, just enjoy it." After the crew had left and Samuel had gone inside to change out of his wet clothes, Dahlia found herself alone with Xavier again. The well stood between them, a symbol of everything that had changed over the past 2 weeks. "I do not know how to thank you adequately," she said. "You have given me back my life. You never lost it," he said. "You were always living it, just under harder circumstances than anyone should have to endure." "Will you come by again?" she asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. "To check on the well, I mean. Make sure it is working properly." "I will come by," he said, a smile playing at his lips, though perhaps not just for the well. Over the following weeks, Xavier became a regular visitor to the Vance homestead. He would arrive in the evenings after his work was done, sometimes bringing fresh meat from his ranch, sometimes just his company. Dahlia found herself watching for him, her heart lifting every time she saw him riding up the path. They would sit on the porch after supper, talking about everything and nothing, while Samuel practiced his reading inside by lamplight. With the well providing abundant water, Dahlia's garden exploded with growth. She was able to expand it, planting vegetables she had only dreamed of before. She sold the surplus at the general store in Columbia, and for the first time in years, she had actual money saved. She kept meticulous records of every cent, determined to pay Xavier back as agreed, though he never mentioned it. One evening in late September, as the brutal summer heat finally began to break, Xavier arrived with a basket. "I brought something special," he said, looking almost nervous. Inside the basket was fresh peach pie, still warm, and a jar of cream. "My cook made it," he explained. "I thought you might enjoy something sweet." They shared the pie on the porch, and Dahlia thought it might be the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. When she said as much, Xavier looked pleased. "Dahlia," he said, setting down his plate, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "All right." "These past months, getting to know you, spending time with you and Samuel, have been the happiest of my life. You are unlike any woman I have ever met. You are strong and brave and resourceful, but you are also kind and caring and so beautiful it makes my chest ache sometimes just to look at you." She could hardly breathe. "Xavier, please let me finish," he said, taking her hand. His palm was calloused from work, warm and solid against hers. "I know our circumstances are different. I know you value your independence, and I respect that more than I can say. But I have fallen in love with you, Dahlia Vance, and I cannot keep it to myself any longer." Tears sprang to her eyes. "I have fallen in love with you too," she whispered. "I tried not to. I told myself it was foolish, that you were just being kind, but I could not help it." He pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and feeling his heart pounding as fast as hers. They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other under the stars. "There is something else I need to say," Xavier said, pulling back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "Something I need to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, she saw a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the lamplight. "Dahlia Vance, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to respect your strength and your independence. I promise to be a partner, not a master." I promise to love you and Samuel and any children we might have with everything I am. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, then at his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection. This strong, successful man was nervous asking her, a poor homesteader, to marry him. It was almost funny. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms coming up around his neck. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had never let herself dream about. Samuel came bursting out of the cabin, having apparently been listening at the window. "Does this mean Mr. Thornton is going to be my brother?" he asked excitedly. Xavier laughed, keeping one arm around Dahlia. "I suppose it does, if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Samuel exclaimed. "Can I learn to work with the cattle? Can I learn to rope and ride properly?" "Absolutely," Xavier promised. "A rancher needs to know all those things." They were married 6 weeks later, in late October, when the Arizona heat had finally broken and the air had turned crisp and pleasant. The ceremony was small, held at the church in Columbia with just a few close friends and neighbors. Dahlia wore a dress of pale blue that Xavier had bought for her, the finest thing she had ever owned. Samuel stood as her family, walking her down the aisle with solemn pride. Xavier's sister and her husband came from Tucson, and his ranch hands all attended, dressed in their Sunday best. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed her soundly, and the small congregation cheered. Dahlia felt like she was floating, unable to quite believe this was her life now. They had agreed that she and Samuel would move to the ranch house, but Dahlia had insisted on keeping the homestead as well. It was her parents' legacy, and she could not bear to give it up. Xavier had understood completely, suggesting they could use it as a line shack or perhaps rent it to a family in need. The well would continue to serve, benefiting whoever lived there. The ranch house was bigger than anywhere Dahlia had ever lived, with real furniture and glass windows and a kitchen that made her gasp with delight. Xavier's housekeeper, a motherly woman named Rosa, had prepared a feast for their return, and the house was filled with flowers. That night, alone with Xavier for the first time as his wife, Dahlia felt nervous. He was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. This was what partnership was supposed to be, she realized. Two people choosing each other, supporting each other, loving each other as equals. Life on the ranch was an adjustment, but a welcome one. Dahlia learned the rhythms of ranch life, helping Rosa with the household management, learning to keep the books for the ranch operation. She discovered she had a head for numbers and organization, and Xavier was happy to let her take over that aspect of the business. Her garden continued to thrive, now even larger than before, and she sold produce to the general store in such quantities that they began to rely on her as a steady supplier. Samuel flourished under Xavier's mentorship. He learned to ride like he had been born on a horse, and he took to cattle work with enthusiasm. Xavier was patient with him, teaching him not just the skills but the reasoning behind them, treating him like the young man he was becoming rather than a child. Winter passed into spring, and Dahlia discovered she was pregnant. Xavier was overjoyed, treating her like she was made of spun glass, though she insisted she could continue her normal activities. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and she felt strong and healthy throughout. In early September of 1883, she gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after her father. Xavier cried when he held his son for the first time, and Dahlia fell in love with him all over again, seeing the tenderness in his eyes. Samuel, now 15, was fascinated by his nephew and took his role as uncle seriously. He would sit with Dahlia while she nursed the baby, telling her about his day's work, his dreams of one day having his own ranch. Xavier had already promised him a section of land when he came of age, and the boy worked hard to prove himself worthy of the gift. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Dahlia sometimes thought about her old life, those years of carrying water and struggling to survive. It felt like something that had happened to a different person, though she knew it had been her. The scars on her shoulders from the yoke had faded but never fully disappeared, and sometimes she would trace them with her fingers, remembering. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked one night, catching her touching the marks. "Accepting my help, marrying me." "Never," she said firmly. "But I do not regret those years either. They made me who I am. They taught me my own strength. I just wish I had known then that strength did not have to mean suffering alone." "You will never be alone again," he promised, pulling her close. "I will always be here." And he was. Through the years that followed, as they had 2 more children, a daughter they named Margaret and another son they named James. Through droughts and good years, through Samuel growing up and marrying a sweet girl from Colombia and starting his own ranch on the land Xavier had given him. Through the territory becoming a state in 1912 and all the changes that came with progress, the old homestead never stood empty. They rented it to families in need, always for a fair price, and the well continued to provide water for decades. Dahlia made sure of it, visiting regularly, making sure the pump was maintained and the property kept up. It was her way of honoring her parents, of making sure their dream continued even after they were gone. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised her with a trip to San Francisco. It was the first time Dahlia had ever been to a big city, and she was overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds and the buildings that seemed to scrape the sky. But it was also thrilling, seeing a whole different world than the one she had always known. They stayed in a grand hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, saw a show at a real theater. But Dahlia's favorite part was walking along the ocean, feeling the cool breeze and watching the waves crash against the shore. Xavier held her hand the whole time, and they talked about their life together, their children, their dreams for the future. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Dahlia said, watching the sun set over the Pacific. "When I was carrying water all those miles, day after day, I thought that was all life would ever be. Survival and struggle and just trying to make it to the next day." "I am glad I could show you different," Xavier said. "Though I think you would have found happiness eventually, with or without me. You are too strong and too determined not to." "Perhaps," she agreed. "But it would not have been this happiness, this joy. You gave me that, Xavier, you and our children and our life together." He kissed her then, with the ocean breeze in their hair and the cry of seagulls overhead, and it was just as sweet as their first kiss all those years ago. They returned to Arizona, to their ranch and their family, and settled back into the comfortable rhythms of their life. Their children were growing, Thomas already 22 and helping run the ranch, Margaret 17, and being courted by a young lawyer from Tucson, and James 15, and determined to be a veterinarian, the first in their family to pursue formal higher education. Samuel and his wife had 4 children of their own, and family gatherings were loud and chaotic and full of love. Dahlia would watch Xavier surrounded by grandchildren, telling them stories and letting them climb all over him, and her heart would swell with gratitude for this life they had built together. As they grew older, their love only deepened. They knew each other's rhythms, could communicate with just a look. Xavier still brought her flowers for no reason, and she still made his favorite meals just to see him smile. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, much as they had done when they were courting, watching the sun set over land that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving, but had given them everything. The old well on the homestead finally gave out in 1925, after more than 40 years of faithful service. Dahlia stood before it, now 65 years old, and thought about the young woman who had struggled under the weight of water buckets. That woman had been strong, but she had been so tired, so worn down by the constant fight to survive. "Should we have it repaired?" Xavier asked, coming to stand beside her. At 70, he still stood tall and strong, though his hair had gone white and his face was lined with the years of sun and weather. "No," Dahlia said slowly. "I think it has served its purpose. Let it rest." They had a new well dug, this time with modern equipment that made the process take days instead of weeks. The technology had changed so much over the years, but the basic human need for water remained the same. That night, lying in bed with Xavier beside her, Dahlia thought about the arc of their life together. From that first awkward conversation at the creek to this moment, decades of love and partnership and building something meaningful together. She thought about her parents, gone now for over 40 years, and hoped they would be proud of what she had made of their legacy. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, his voice sleepy. "Everything," she said. "How strange life is. How one decision, one moment of swallowing your pride and accepting help can change everything." "I would have kept trying," he admitted. "If you had kept refusing, I would have found other ways to help, other excuses to see you. I was half in love with you already, watching you make that journey every day. Your determination, your strength, the way you never complained or gave up. I admired you long before I knew you." "I am glad you built that well," she said, rolling over to face him. "I am glad you asked for my hand." "I am glad I said yes. I would say yes 1,000 times over." He kissed her forehead, and they fell asleep holding hands, the way they had done for over 4 decades. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. They lost friends to age and illness, watched as the world changed in ways both wonderful and frightening. The automobile replaced the horse in most places, though Xavier stubbornly kept a stable of horses until the end of his life, insisting that some things should not change just because they could. Margaret married her lawyer and moved to Tucson, where she became involved in women's suffrage and social reform. Thomas took over the ranch completely, running it with the same care and wisdom his father had shown. James became a veterinarian as he had dreamed, and eventually returned to Arizona to practice, making a name for himself treating ranch animals throughout the territory. Samuel remained their closest friend and neighbor, and he and Xavier would often ride the property line together. 2 old men on horses, talking about the old days and the new world that was emerging around them. In 1932, Xavier fell ill with pneumonia. Despite Dahlia's constant care and the best doctors they could afford, he did not recover. He died on a clear October morning, 77 years old, with Dahlia holding his hand and their children gathered around the bed. "I love you," he whispered with his last breath. "My strong, beautiful wife, thank you for saying yes." "I love you too," she said through her tears. "Thank you for asking." His death nearly broke her, but she was still that strong woman who had carried water for miles, and she endured. She leaned on her children and grandchildren, let them care for her as she had cared for them. She continued to live in the ranch house, though Thomas and his family urged her to come stay with them. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Mine and Xavier's. I will stay here as long as I am able." She lived 7 more years, remaining sharp and active until the very end. She saw great-grandchildren born, watched the world slide into another war, saw technology advance in ways that would have seemed like magic when she was young. But her favorite place remained the porch of the ranch house, where she and Xavier had spent so many evenings together. She would sit there in the twilight, remembering, and sometimes she swore she could feel him beside her, his hand in hers. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1939, at the age of 79. They buried her next to Xavier on a hill overlooking the valley, where you could see for miles in every direction. The old homestead was visible from there, and the place where the original well had stood, though both were barely recognizable now, reclaimed by time and nature. At her funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Arizona, Thomas stood to give the eulogy. He talked about his mother's strength, her kindness, her determination. He told the story of how she had carried water for miles every day, how his father had built a well and asked for her hand, how their love had created a legacy that would continue for generations. "My mother taught us that accepting help is not weakness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught us that love is partnership, that strength can be gentle, that the greatest courage is not in standing alone but in choosing to let someone stand with you. She and my father built something beautiful together, and we are all the beneficiaries of their love." The family gathered after the funeral at the ranch house, filling it with noise and life the way Dahlia would have wanted. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren ran through the rooms where she had raised her family, and if you listened carefully, you could almost hear her laughter echoing in the halls. Years later, when the old ranch house was finally modernized, they found something tucked away in a drawer of Dahlia's desk. It was a ledger, carefully maintained, showing every payment she had made to Xavier for the cost of the well. The entries stopped in 1890 with a note in Xavier's handwriting. "Debt paid in full with interest of 7 children, 14 grandchildren, and more love than one man deserves. I am the one in debt now." Below it, in Dahlia's handwriting, "Then we are even, my love. For you gave me a well, and I gave you my heart, and both were fair trades." The ledger was framed and hung in Thomas's house, where it remained for generations, a testament to a love that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into something that shaped an entire family's destiny. The well that Xavier had built, the one that had changed everything, became something of a local legend. Even after it was no longer in use, people would visit it, drawn by the story of the rancher who fell in love with the woman carrying water. It became a symbol of how one act of compassion can ripple through time, changing lives in ways impossible to predict. The land continued to be worked by Dahlia and Xavier's descendants, generation after generation, each one knowing the story of how it all began. The story of a woman strong enough to carry water for miles, but wise enough to accept help when it was offered. The story of a man wealthy enough to solve problems with money, but smart enough to know that what he was really offering was partnership and love. And on summer evenings, when the Arizona heat finally breaks and the air turns soft and cool, if you stand on that hill where Dahlia and Xavier rest, you can almost hear the ghost of water pumping from that original well, the sound that changed everything, the sound of 2 lives joining into one beautiful whole. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on the land, still work the ranch, still tell the story of Dahlia and Xavier. And when young couples marry, when love seems impossible or circumstances seem too difficult, the family tells them about the woman who carried water and the rancher who built a well, and reminds them that true love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about seeing someone struggle and choosing to help. It is about accepting help with grace. It is about building something together that neither person could build alone. The story became part of Arizona folklore, shared around campfires and dinner tables, passed down through generations. Some details were embellished, others forgotten, but the heart of it remained true. A love story born from compassion and watered with respect, growing into something that would outlast them both. In the end, that is what Dahlia and Xavier gave to the world. Not just children and grandchildren, not just a successful ranch or a productive garden, but a story that reminded people that love can grow in the harshest conditions, that strength and vulnerability can coexist, that the greatest gift you can give someone is not to solve their problems, but to stand beside them as they solve their own. The water stopped flowing from that original well decades ago, but the love it represented never dried up. It continued to flow through generations, nourishing hearts and souls the way that well had once nourished the garden and the land. And that is the legacy of Dahlia Vance and Xavier Thornton. Not wealth or land or even the many descendants they left behind, but the simple, profound truth that love offered with respect and accepted with grace can transform everything, can turn miles of struggle into a journey worth taking, can make two separate lives into one beautiful story that echoes through time.